In a small patch of trees, in the borderland of Selkirk, you will find a very unassuming, small stone well. Written above it is the words Tam Lin's Well. It sits in a now largely forgotten piece of land, its legends and mysteries becoming ever more lost in the consciousness of the Scottish people. The stories of chalk circles and faerie rings, the enchanting powers of those from the other world. It has all been forgotten, yet at one time this small patch of trees was the great border forest of Carterhaugh, a gateway to the other side, and the well, a sacred spring where reverence was paid to the Daoine or faerie folk, a place where these words were once widely known. "Oh, I forbid ye, maidens all, that wear gold in your hair, to come or gang by Carterhaugh, for young Tam Lin is there." Many years ago, in the town of Selkirk, there was a well-known legend which concerned a young man by the name of Tam Lin, the grandson of the Laird of Roxburgh. It tells that while out hunting one day in the great forest of Carterhaugh, the young lad fell from his horse. The boy lay wounded, calling for help, and his distressed cries were answered by nature itself. The lad was rescued by the Grand Queen of the Sidhe. He was taken by the fairy retinue to the great green hill, and there he entered the other realm, Elfame. It was said that the fairy queen took particular interest in young Tam Lin, and would make him a powerful knight of the Elven company, a rare human leader of the Slua. He would be given the very fitting task of protecting the forest of Carterhaugh. The townsfolk would tell that Tam Lin would only let those young maidens pass who granted him a great treasure, or gifted him the grandest prize of all, their very maidenhood. The legend of Tam Lin was very well known by the true protagonist of this tale, a young maiden by the name of Janet. She was the daughter of a powerful earl who lived in a large castle near the forest of Carterhaugh. One day the young lass grew tired of childish games and sewing with the ladies of her father's house, and so decided to explore the forest. The almost magical landscape within the trees stunned the young maid with its beauty. She walked for some time, lost in the splendour of life surrounding her. Eventually, the maiden saw a stone well in the distance, but it was guarded by thorns and tight-knit trees. The maiden pulled up her green kirtle and pushed through the barrier, breaking a tree branch to forge her path. There at the well, she beheld the most beautiful wild roses she had ever seen. It was as if they began to bloom the very instant she set foot in the opening. The maiden leaned in, smelling the flowers, and picked a rose for herself. At once, a quiet but accusing voice was heard. "Why pulls thou the rose, Janet? And why breaks thou the wand? Or why comes thou to Carterhaugh without my command?" Before her now stood a tall man, who declared his name was Tam Lin, the Elven knight. Janet, with no fear, stood her ground. "My father owns these lands, and the forest of Carterhaugh is mine, a present from the Earl. I do not require your command to walk in my own forest." The Elven knight had never seen a woman so brave or fearless. He was instantly smitten by her, and what happens next will be left up to your imagination, although it is safe to say that when Janet left the forest, she was a maiden no more. In the following days, the Earl discovered that his daughter is now with child, and demands the name of which of his loyal men is to blame. But Janet will not lie. She says, "If that I gie with child feather, mysel' maun bear the blame." There's near a laird about your haw shall get the bairn's name. If my love were an earthly nicht, as he's an elven grey, I wadna gie my ain true love for nae lord that ye hae. Her father, furious at the response, demands that the child be killed. He orders his daughter to return to the forest and collect herbs with which to induce a miscarriage. Now Janet dared not directly disobey him more, and so with all haste returns to Carterhaugh, but not to pick the herbs. Once again she finds the well, and once again picks a red rose, and the young knight appears and asks, "Why pulls thou the rose, Janet, amang the groves sae green, and to kill the bonny babe that we gats us between?" The steadfast young woman tells the knight of her struggles, and asks his help. Tam sadly refuses, although he wants nothing more than to be with Janet. He is held in these woods by a powerful enchantment. He tells the young woman his tragic tale. The hunt, the fall, the Queen of Elfame, it is all true. Ever since I was taken to the realm of the Sidhe, I have been bound to this forest. By day I am the guardian of Carterhaugh, and by night I return to the Queen's side. I wish I could return to a mortal life, and be free to live with you. The guardian knight spoke with such pain and sorrow that it caused the young woman to cry, "Is there no way to break the spell? I want to win you back with all my heart." Tam Lin explains that every 7 years, on the night of Samhain, the Sidhe must sacrifice one of their own to the fires. On this night, the veil between our world and that of the Sidhe will be at its thinnest. It is then that the Slua will ride out to perform this sacrifice, led by the very Queen herself. It just so happens that this was the very day of Samhain, and he tells Janet to wait near the Miles Cross at midnight, for then and there the faerie host will ride by, and this will be her only chance to free her love from the Sidhe. The first elven knight will ride a black horse, the second a brown horse, then I shall pass on a white horse, dressed as elven royalty. You must run to me, throw me from my horse, and cover me with your green shawl. And no matter what dark magics the Queen of Elfame casts upon me, you must hold me fast. Janet looked deep within the man's eyes, and promised that she would do this, and that they would both be free by the dawn. As evening came, the young woman sat hidden near Miles Cross. She waited many hours, and always in constant terror of the flitting shapes and figures cast by the moon. But then in the silence of the night she heard movement, the sound of clinking metal and hooves. She beheld a dazzling silver light emitting from the faerie host as they moved quietly through the night. The pale elven faces of the knights and the soldiers were not only lit by the moon, but their own ethereal glow. The young woman was accustomed to the air of nobility, being an earl's daughter, but she had never before seen such lordly beings. An overwhelming sense of power and wonder emanated from each and every one of the riders. Then, as a black horse passed her, she beheld the radiant splendour of the Queen of the Daoine. Gentle yet regal features covered a feeling of indescribable authority. Then a brown horse passed her, and seated upon that horse was a grand knight, covered in gold and bright gemstones. The woman continued to wait until at last the third horse came by, a wonderful pure white creature, and mounted atop a silver armour-clad knight, with a golden circlet placed on his head. This must surely be Tam. Janet leapt from the bushes and ran to the white horse, pulling the knight from his saddle and holding him tight. A cry went up from the host, "Tam Lin's away!" The black horse at the head of the Slua reared high as the elven queen pulled him to a halt. Now the menacing eyes of the enraged queen landed upon Tam Lin. and with an angry scream of unknown words, he began to change. As Janet held on to the man she loved, she felt his form turn lighter and smaller. Eventually, he would become a horrible lizard and try and claw the woman, but still she held tight to him. Then she felt a slithering in her hands, and Tam had turned into a snake, which began to coil and wrap itself around the woman's neck. Once more she closed her eyes and bit her lip, refusing to let go. Suddenly, a searing pain landed in Janet's hands. The snake had now become a red-hot coal, and was burning through skin and flesh. Screams of pure agony were torn from the woman, but she would not let go. At last the queen knew that she had been beaten by the love of two mortals, and returned Tam to his original shape. Out then spoke the queen of the fairies, and an angry woman was she. Shame betide her ill-fared face, and an ill death may she die, for she's taken awa the bonniest knight in my company. But had I kent Tam Lin, said she, what now this night I see, I would hae taken out the twa grey een, and put in twa in a tree. In triumph, the young Janet threw her green shawl about Tam, as the faintest glimmer of dawn appeared on the horizon. Seeing the golden light of day, the Sidhe spurred their horses, and quickly vanished into the night. Tam took Janet by her burned and blistered hands, and together they would return to her father's castle. There it is told that Janet proved to her father she was no liar, and he would apologise to his daughter and bless the union of Janet and Tam Lin, who would go on to live happily for many years in the lands of Selkirk. But the pair would never forget the night of Samhain, and marked it each and every year with a walk in the forest of Carterhaugh, where the two lovers would reach the well, and Tam would pick his beloved a brilliant red rose, and kiss the scarred hands that saved his life. Thank you for listening, and a special thank you to my wonderful patrons for helping me keep these tales alive. This is one of the oldest ballads of its kind in Scotland, with the first written rendition being found in the 1549 book The Complaint of Scotland, although it is thought that the oral history of this tale stretches back even further. Evidence suggests that this story of faerie romance was already a well-known tale long before it was adapted to song and ballad. Like most old tales, there are many versions of the story, which have grown and changed throughout time. In some, Janet goes hunting, specifically for Tam Lin. In others, she's just in the wrong place at the wrong time. One of the major differences that you will find in so many tellings of this tale is a subject a little difficult to talk about on YouTube, but in many versions of this tale, it is heavily implied or outright stated that the sexual relationship between Janet and Tam Lin was not a consensual one, even stating that the taking of a rose or deflowering of the plant, along with its red colour, suggests real or symbolic rape. But this just isn't the case. The older versions of the tale all suggest that the relationship was completely consensual, and that Janet was a strong woman with her own agency in this tale, which is more in the line of how we see females portrayed in many old Scottish tales and ballads, like the Fairy Queen herself as the all-powerful matriarch of the Sidhe. It is only as years go on that we begin to see the introduction of this forceful act into the story, coinciding with the prevailing negative view of women at the time. Some even suggest that Tam Lin is dealing out punitive rape to Janet as a penalty for entering the forest, a punishment that became quite popular in the 1600s. Not unsurprisingly, this was during the first great Scottish witch hunt, where rights and respect for women was near non-existent. This Orwellian change in ballads and tales is unfortunately quite common. Many would seek to conform the old tales and traditions into the more restrictive views of the day, especially when concerning female sexuality. It would seem to these people more moral to have a pure woman assaulted than for a woman to knowingly seek sexual pleasure. I must say that I am somewhat glad to find that this was never the original intention of the tale. As it was told in the old days, Tam Lin was the story of a young woman who voluntarily sought out and fell in love with an enchanted young man in the forest. She never renounced her child and fought hard to keep the baby, even though she was pressured by many not to do so. She would then go on to brave the nightmares and agony inflicted on her by the Queen of Elfame, all to save the one she loved, the one she was devoted to, the one she had chosen. I find it somewhat interesting that this tale of a defiant, expressive female protagonist was changed to a tale of corruption and victimhood. I do not have the evidence to blame any party specifically, but to me it's certainly a curious observation. There seems to be some discussion on whether Tam Lin was entirely human. Some versions of this tale tell of him as the guardian she of Carterhaugh. In others, he is the offspring of the faerie queen and a mortal that she met in the forest, and perhaps the trials Janet faces are to prove her worth for having a she-child. In those versions which tell of Tam Lin's mortal nature, there is often a description of how he was taken to Elfame, and his father or grandfather is usually given a name, one which would be well known to the locals hearing the tale. This was commonly the Roxburgh family, but the names Fowis, Kirk, Forbes and Murray all appear in various iterations of the ballad and tale. The actions of Janet, waiting by the crossing and pulling the man from the horse, even undergoing the Faerie Queen's trials, are all aspects that show up in many other Scottish tales in relation to the she, which to me suggests that this method may have been quite well known by the people of the time. It may have been a tradition that they were very well aware of. The concept of the Fey Troop, or Slua, marching out on Samhain or Halloween night is also very important to the tale, as it is on that night that the veil between the worlds is its thinnest and most permeable. Yet the suggestion of fairy sacrifice on this night does not seem to fit with any information or history I could find, and appears to be a later addition, most likely used to depict the Fae as savage and denounce the old religious beliefs. Many versions of the Tam Lin tale suggest that the Fae are to sacrifice a man each year to the devil, which may seem like an odd commingling of religions. But at one time, the Christian Church, while attempting to incorporate pagan beliefs, told that the Fae of old were fallen angels who had not yet reached hell, and all paid great reverence to Lucifer. This is a warping of a well-known tradition in Scotland, that being the procession of the Sidhe on the evening of each quarter day, with Samhain being the quarter day mentioned in the tale. That is why the Slua appeared that night. It was an ancient celebration of life, with nothing to do with angels or devils. The various transformations of Tam Lin during his rescue remind me somewhat of Peleus in Greek mythology. Peleus was the father of the famous hero Achilles, but before that, the man was determined to capture and marry the sea nymph Thetis. When Peleus grasped the sea nymph in his hands, it began to change shape, and the man struggled to hold her through all of the transformations, before she finally succumbed to the warrior's grasp and agreed to be wed. This very insight was also noted by Francis James Child, the American folklorist, whose wonderful collection of Scottish ballads displays well over 10 versions of the Tam Lin story, including some of the oldest known sources. The final verse, spoken by the Faerie Queen, tells us that if she had known the future, she would have removed Tam Lin's grey eyes and replaced them with wooden ones. It is common in many tales of the Sidhe in Scotland to come across the fairy ointment, a substance which is known by a great many names. But this ointment would grant mortals the power to see the Sidhe at all times, to visualize spirits of beings of the other realm. This power of sight was also brought on by holding or keeping items from the Fae world, but in our tale, the Queen of Elfheim seems to propose a somewhat opposite form of this practice. As with the wooden eyes of nature, Tam Lin could see and live as one of the Sidhe, but without his mortal eyes, he would never again look upon the mortal world, meaning in our case, he would never meet and fall in love with Janet. I now circle back to the very beginning of this video, when I mentioned the modern-day well of Tam Lin. Unfortunately, it's a largely forgotten area, mostly overgrown now, covered in weeds and nettles, which to me is quite fitting in many ways. I like to think that it will become completely covered and obscured by vegetation, and one day, far in the future, this ancient well will be discovered by a young maiden, and there she might meet whichever spirit now protects the well and whatever is left of the once great forest. There is so much information on the different versions of this tale. There are hidden meanings, symbolism, related tales, over 50 known versions, and individual changes by thousands of storytellers over hundreds of years. So if you are interested, there's plenty more information out there to discover about Tam Lin. But until then, Sláinte mhath.